Hello, I'm Peter Urban, the Senior Global Electoral Advisor of IFES and the Senior Country Director of IFES Ukraine. As part of IFES's support to the Central Election Commission and the election process in Ukraine, IFES is proud to launch our Election Integrity Assessment. It is the result of months of research and analysis and more than 20 years of experience in Ukraine. This is a comprehensive long-term resource providing recommendations to address fraud vulnerabilities across the entire electoral process. This short video provides a useful introduction to the assessment, complementing the written executive summary and the full report. It also begins important discussions and collaboration to further strengthen this critical component of Ukraine's sustainable democracy.
Hello, my name is Catherine Eleanor. I'm Global Legal Advisor for the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. IFES has an electoral integrity assessment methodology that analyzes vulnerabilities throughout the electoral process to three different integrity distinctions: malpractice, fraud, and systemic manipulation. Malpractice is essentially mistakes or negligence by election officials or other stakeholders with a duty of care in the electoral process. Fraud is defined as deliberate wrongdoing by certain stakeholders in elections. And systemic manipulation is related to the legal framework for elections, where laws or rules are manipulated in a certain way to influence the process or outcome of elections. These integrity distinctions are important because it helps stakeholders identify what the true vulnerabilities may be in an election and then identify appropriate responses. For example, if there is a malpractice vulnerability, this may indicate that more training may be required. However, if there is a fraud vulnerability, this may mean there needs to be stronger justice mechanisms and prosecutions for those involved. IFES has found in many countries where we work that if there is an irregularity in an election, people may immediately perceive that there has been wrongdoing or fraud, where in reality there may just be mistakes. This is an important distinction as it changes the public narrative around elections and is important in an era of declining trust in institutions. The assessment is different from an election observation report in that it does not focus on a particular election and what may have gone right or wrong. Rather, it focuses on potential vulnerabilities in the system or process that need to be addressed or areas that need to be strengthened to ensure the entire system is resilient moving forward. The Electoral Integrity Assessment examines all categories of the electoral process, right through from electoral system design to election dispute resolution and everything in between. It looks not only at the election management body, but all institutions, actors, and stakeholders in the electoral process. This includes security personnel, corruption bodies, voters, political parties, the media, and other stakeholders. Because the assessment focuses on vulnerability, it can be perceived to be more negative than other types of assessments or reports. However, it is not looking at whether certain types of fraud, manipulation, or mistake exist, but the vulnerability to those different integrity dimensions. In many ways, it is similar to a risk assessment that is looking for areas of vulnerability that need to be addressed by different institutions to ensure the strength of the system overall. Each of the categories examined is further divided into subcategories, and these are given 2 scores. Level of vulnerability, that is, how serious is the vulnerability, and potential or probable impact, that is, what impact might the vulnerability have on the electoral process or outcome. This is important as you may have a very small vulnerability in the process that can have a very significant impact on the outcome, or vice versa. Something may be considered to be an extremely serious vulnerability, but the impact it actually has on the process or the outcome is small. I led IFES's Electoral Integrity Assessment mission to Ukraine in mid to late 2018. This video is intended to provide an introduction to the findings from that assessment mission, which included a legal and election dispute resolution expert, an electoral systems and voter registration expert, an electoral operations expert, and an expert in media, political parties, and civil society. As with all electoral integrity assessments that IFAS has conducted around the world, there are multiple vulnerabilities within the Ukraine electoral system and process. Again, this is not intended to be a critique of the Ukrainian system, simply an opportunity to identify vulnerabilities that stakeholders then have an opportunity to prioritize and address. With respect to systemic manipulation, 3 categories have been scored for this particular type of vulnerability in Ukraine: the legal framework, the institutional framework, and the referendum process. When talking about the legal framework for elections in Ukraine, systemic manipulation vulnerabilities relate to Parliament's failure to act on certain types of reform. For example, effective regulation of internal political party democracy, or more effective enforcement measures to ensure gender equity. Because many interlocutors consider that these gaps are allowed to persist in the legal framework, this is considered deliberate systemic manipulation of the framework overall. In terms of the referendum process, there has been more recent history of overt systemic manipulation with the passage of the National Referendum Law. While this law has since been repealed as unconstitutional, the risk that another similar law be enacted still remains, as does the fact that there is still a gap in the law with respect to referendums in Ukraine, and this gap could be used to manipulate a referendum process. When looking at the institutional framework category, the vulnerability here relates to a lack of clarity in the rules regarding the appointment of members to the Central Election Commission, or CEC. It is important that these rules are clear so that the public can have trust in the independence and leadership of commissioners of an election management body. Until these rules are clear, this is considered a systemic manipulation vulnerability, although at present it is considered low, as the current commission has just been appointed for new 7-year terms. When you look at comparative systemic manipulation vulnerability profiles for other countries, you can see that Ukraine actually has less in other categories than some countries, for example Myanmar. It is common in all countries for there to be some vulnerability with respect to the legal framework or the process of law reform. Looking at the fraud vulnerability profile for Ukraine, there are a number of categories that are scored for this type of vulnerability, but there are different levels of seriousness or potential impact depending on the category. 2 of the highest categories with this vulnerability are political parties and candidates and political finance. With respect to political parties and candidates, internal democracy in political parties is considered to be weak. Candidate nomination processes are opaque, gender quotas are generally ignored, and it's considered that political parties are essentially commercialized for the purpose of manipulating representation on election commissions. This is compounded by fraud vulnerability in the political finance category. There are significant opportunities for political actors to use what are so-called third parties for raising and spending money in relation to election campaigns. And the current political finance framework does not effectively address the abuse of state resources and vote buying. This is a similar picture in the media category, where regulation of political advertising and media actors during elections is limited. Candidates who are affiliated with media owners gain significant advantage in terms of the exposure they receive in the media. An election season is essentially known as harvest time for privately owned media in the country. The institutional framework category is another one that is vulnerable to fraud and can have significant impact on many other categories of the electoral process. The nomination and appointment process for commissioners on TECs, DECs, and PECs can be manipulated by political parties to gain excessive representation on these commissions, which could open the door to fraudulent exercise of influence either before, during, or after election day. Finally, there are some smaller vulnerabilities in the fraud category. With respect to counting, interlocutors have described several potential methods to abuse this phase of the process to alter results protocols in a fraudulent manner. There are also potential vulnerabilities in the aggregation and certification of results, particularly at the DEC level, where there's a lack of transparency around data entry, and this part of the process is also potentially vulnerable to cyber attacks. Finally, with respect to election dispute resolution, the independence and impartiality of both election management arbiters and judges has been questioned, and administrative and criminal violations are not properly investigated and sanctioned, which can result in a climate of impunity in Ukraine. Interestingly, when you compare the fraud vulnerability category from Ukraine to that of Kenya from an assessment in 2017, you can see a very similar picture in terms of the categories that are represented and the different levels of seriousness. Some of the most concerning categories are the same in terms of political parties and candidates and political finance. The two countries also share some vulnerabilities with respect to election dispute resolution, which, as seen in Kenya, can become a fundamental part of the electoral process. While election security concerns were very high in Kenya, this is considered slightly lower in the Ukrainian context, but still a potential area of vulnerability. Finally, the malpractice vulnerability profile in Ukraine is multifaceted and complex. Again, this is not uncommon. IFAS often sees vulnerabilities across all categories of the electoral process to certain types of mistakes or negligence. In Ukraine, election dispute resolution is one of the highest categories of vulnerability to malpractice. This is considered to have been a consistent weakness in all of Ukraine's prior elections, and there are a web of different types of vulnerabilities across the different bodies responsible for election dispute resolution, including the judiciary. There are overlapping jurisdiction for different types of disputes and complaints, and multiple entry points for people to complain, which can lead to forum shopping. There are a high proportion of complaints that are dismissed on formalities, and the deadlines in the law for dispute resolution are very short, making it difficult to carry out an effective investigation. Malpractice vulnerabilities around the counting process also impact on election dispute resolution. Duplicate results documentation makes the whole process vulnerable in case of a challenge to the results. And several factors increase the chances of election officials making mistakes during the counting process. PECs are required to make multiple different counts and reconciliations, and the design of the results protocol itself does not facilitate the reconciliation process. The procedures do not mandate immediate double counts of all totals and recalculating all reconciled figures, potentially resulting in the PEC failing to discover mistakes until the end of the process. This is exacerbated by weaknesses in other categories, for example, polling officials' lack of training. When you compare the malpractice vulnerability profile from Ukraine to that of Kenya from 2017, you can see some similarities in some of the higher scored categories of vulnerability. However, in Kenya, many of the categories are clustered together in the higher part of the graph, whereas in Ukraine, there are vulnerabilities that exist in the process but are considered to be less serious. One particular area of serious vulnerability in Kenya was the aggregation and certification of results, whereas this is considered to be of a less serious nature in Ukraine. Similarly, in Kenya, there were significant vulnerabilities and challenges around the electoral system and boundary delimitation, which are not considered to have the same level of vulnerability in Ukraine. However, some categories are shared across the two countries, such as election dispute resolution, legal framework, institutional framework, political parties and candidates, counting, and election security. And these are all areas that both Ukraine and Kenya will need to address moving forward. Looking at malpractice vulnerabilities around political parties and candidates, while there are some political party interlocutors who acknowledge the need for strengthened internal party democracy, progress is slow. Most parties focus on women's wings or youth wings, rather than on structural changes to how candidates are chosen. There are also malpractice vulnerabilities with respect to the legal framework, which is complex and split over at least 11 different laws. Last-minute legal changes are also a problem in terms of the stability of the legal framework. Malpractice vulnerabilities exist in the training and capacity building category and institutional framework category, and these are closely linked. There is a large number of lower-level election commissioners, more than 500,000 people during the electoral cycle. There are short timelines to complete work, limited funding for training, and the frequent replacement of election commissioners means that many officials remained untrained in Ukraine at the time of elections. Linkages are also seen with vulnerabilities in the legal framework category and in the election budgeting and funding category. Late changes to rules have in the past rendered previous training out of date, and the CEC's training centre remains heavily donor dependent, which is an unsustainable model. Finally, the media category displays an array of malpractice vulnerabilities. There is a lack of effective regulation, monitoring and enforcement for media offences, and this creates a culture of impunity for media violations. There is a perceived willingness of the National Broadcasting Council to shift responsibility for regulation enforcement to other bodies, which in essence prevents it from serving as an authoritative body. There is cause for optimism for elections in Ukraine. For example, the voter register is comprehensive and is regularly updated. Domestic election observation is robust, and monitoring efforts of different parts of the electoral process are increasingly sophisticated. There are also new laws, for example, that provide some regulation of money in politics. The CEC does not work in a vacuum and is not the only institution or stakeholder with a role in ensuring credible elections in Ukraine. It is important for all institutions, actors, and stakeholders to play their part in ensuring credible elections rather than undermining the electoral process or public trust in that process. I encourage you to use the Electoral Integrity Assessment report as a long-term resource and a blueprint for addressing vulnerabilities within the entire electoral system and process in Ukraine. The report provides a separate chapter for each of the 18 different categories in the electoral process. It therefore provides different stakeholders with a detailed deep dive into these different technical topics.
IFES believes this is an extremely useful assessment, unique in its scope and long-term value. It can serve for years to come to inform lessons learned, strategic planning, electoral reform, and other initiatives. We welcome and encourage your feedback as well as discussions on how we can best help to support your efforts to continue strengthening the electoral process and thus democracy of Ukraine.